The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek as Lila Lancaster stumbled forward, her wrists bound tightly behind her back, the rope cutting into her flesh. A jeering crowd had formed outside the sheriff's office, their faces contorted with righteous indignation as they watched the spectacle unfold before them. It was the summer of 1871, and in this remote corner of Colorado territory, justice was often swift and merciless. "This is what happens to thieves in Redemption Creek," Sheriff Tobias Marks announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the gathered townsfolk. His deputy dragged Lila toward the hitching post in front of the jailhouse, her honey blonde hair falling across her face, partially obscuring the defiance in her amber eyes. "I didn't steal anything," Lila shouted, struggling against the ropes that bound her. "Your precious mayor's son planted that watch in my satchel. I've never stolen anything in my life." The sheriff grabbed her arm roughly. "Tell it to the judge when he arrives next week. Until then, you'll serve as a reminder of what happens to those who don't respect the law in my town." Lila glanced desperately around the crowd, searching for a sympathetic face, but found none. She had only been in Redemption Creek for 3 days, having arrived on the stagecoach looking for work after fleeing her uncle's home in Denver. At 22 years old, she had hoped to make a fresh start, away from the unwanted advances of her mother's brother who had taken her in after her parents' deaths. Now she was being publicly humiliated for a crime she didn't commit, and there wasn't a soul in this town who would speak up for her. The deputy began securing the chain around the post, wrapping it around her waist and locking it with a heavy padlock. The metal was cold against her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded as the sheriff announced she would remain there until nightfall before being moved to a cell. "Water," Lila pleaded, her throat parched from the dust and the heat. "Please, may I have some water?" The sheriff ignored her request, turning away as the last of the onlookers drifted back to their daily business. Lila slumped against the post, trying to find a position that wouldn't pull painfully at her arms. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and she closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A tall, broad-shouldered man on a chestnut stallion rode slowly down the main street, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He drew his horse to a stop a few yards away, observing the scene before him with obvious curiosity. Layla met his gaze defiantly, refusing to appear weak despite her circumstances. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a nearby rail before approaching. His spurs jingled with each deliberate step, and the townsfolk who remained nearby grew silent, watching with interest. "What's going on here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable note of authority. The sheriff emerged from his office, hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "Nothing that concerns you, stranger, just dealing with a thief." The newcomer's eyes startlingly blue against his sun-bronzed skin assessed Layla carefully. "You always chain women to posts in this town, seems a mite uncivilized." "Stay out of this," Sheriff Marks warned. "This isn't your business." "I'm making it my business." The stranger took another step forward, and Layla could see him more clearly now, tall and powerfully built, with a day's growth of beard darkening his jaw. He wore a faded blue shirt beneath a leather vest, and dusty trail-worn chaps over his denim trousers. "What's she supposed to have stolen?" Mayor Wilson's son reported his gold pocket watch missing after this woman served him at the hotel restaurant yesterday. "We found it in her belongings this morning." "I didn't take it," Layla repeated wearily. "Harold Wilson has been making advances since I arrived. When I rejected him, he swore I'd regret it." The stranger nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. And nobody thought to question the mayor's son about his accusations. Sheriff Marks stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "I don't know who you think you are, mister, but in Redemption Creek we handle our affairs without outside interference. Name's Ethan Quinn. the stranger replied evenly. "I've been riding for the past 3 days from Denver. Thought I'd stop here for supplies before heading to my brother's ranch near Silverton." He glanced at Lila again. Wasn't expecting to find such a warm welcome. Several of the townsfolk had returned, sensing the tension between the sheriff and this newcomer. Lila held her breath, uncertain what would happen next but grateful that someone, even a stranger, had shown the decency to question her treatment. "Well, Mr. Quinn," the sheriff said, "you can get your supplies and be on your way. This woman stays where she is until I decide otherwise." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't think so." Before anyone could react, he strode to the hitching post and examined the chain that bound Lila. "This isn't how justice works, Sheriff, not in any civilized place I know of." "Step away from the prisoner," Marks demanded, drawing his pistol. In one swift movement, Ethan drew his own weapon, holding it casually at his side. "I don't want trouble, Sheriff, but I'm not leaving this woman chained up in the hot sun without a trial." The crowd murmured nervously, and Lila saw several people backing away, anticipating violence. "You're outnumbered," the sheriff warned as his deputy appeared in the doorway of the office, rifle in hand. "Maybe," Ethan conceded, "but I'm betting neither of you wants to die today." His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but there was steel beneath the words. The standoff stretched for several long seconds. Lila could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out from the crowd. "The stranger's right, Sheriff. This ain't proper." It was Mrs. Fletcher, the widow who owned the town's general store. She stepped forward, clutching her shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. "We all know Harold Wilson's reputation with the ladies. Maybe you ought to hear the girl out proper instead of making a spectacle like this." Several other townspeople murmured in agreement, emboldened by the widow's intervention. Lila felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the deputies had dragged her from her room that morning. Sheriff Marks looked around, realizing that public opinion was shifting. His face darkened with anger, but he slowly holstered his weapon. "Fine. We'll do this proper. She can wait in a cell until the circuit judge arrives." "That's better," Ethan said, but he didn't put away his pistol. "Now let's get these chains off her." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded to his deputy, who produced a key from his pocket. As he approached, Ethan stopped him with a raised hand. "I've got this." Before anyone could object, he drew a small leather pouch from inside his vest and removed what appeared to be lockpicking tools. With deft movements that suggested considerable practice, he had the padlock open in seconds. As the chain fell away, Lila gasped in relief, though her hands remained bound behind her. She looked up at Ethan Quinn with gratitude, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan nodded once, then turned back to the sheriff. "The ropes, too. She's not going anywhere." After a tense moment, the sheriff signaled to his deputy, who reluctantly cut Lila's bonds. She brought her arms around to the front, wincing at the pain as blood rushed back into her numb fingers. Angry red marks circled her wrists where the ropes had dug into her skin. "She still needs to be locked up," the sheriff insisted stubbornly. "Not without proper evidence," Ethan countered. "I want to hear more about this missing watch." Before the sheriff could respond, a commotion at the far end of the street drew everyone's attention. A young man on horseback came galloping toward them, nearly colliding with several pedestrians before reining in his mount just short of the gathered crowd. "Sheriff," he called out, breathless with excitement or fear. "There's been a robbery at my father's bank. 2 men armed." "They're heading west out of town," the sheriff cursed under his breath, momentarily forgetting about Lila and Ethan. "Thompson, get the horses," he shouted to his deputy. "Round up some men. We need to catch them before they reach the pass." In the ensuing chaos, Ethan took Lila's arm gently. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of here while they're distracted." Lila hesitated only briefly before allowing him to lead her toward his horse. She had no reason to trust this stranger, but he had stood up for her when no one else would. And right now, getting away from Sheriff Marks seemed like the wisest course of action. Ethan helped her mount, then swung up behind her. With a flick of the reins, the chestnut stallion trotted down a side street, away from the commotion. Lila was acutely aware of the solid presence of the man behind her, his arms reaching around her to hold the reins. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "Somewhere safe," Ethan replied. "Then we'll figure out how to clear your name." As they rode away from Redemption Creek, Lila couldn't help wondering if she had just escaped one dangerous situation only to ride headlong into another. But something in Ethan Quinn's steady gaze and the way he had stood up to the sheriff made her trust him, at least for now. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Lila's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the day's events and wondering what would happen next. Finally, Ethan guided his horse off the trail and into a small clearing beside a creek. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Lila down. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride and she stumbled slightly. Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her with strong hands. "Thank you," she said, stepping away quickly and looking around at their surroundings. "Where are we?" "About 5 miles outside of town," Ethan replied, leading his horse to the creek. "This is an old trapper's camp I've used before. We should be safe here for the night." Lila wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly uncertain. "I don't even know you, Mr. Quinn." "Ethan," he corrected as he removed the saddle from his horse. "And I don't know you either, miss. Lancaster, Lila Lancaster." She watched as he efficiently set up a small camp, gathering firewood and unpacking supplies from his saddlebags. "Why did you help me back there?" Ethan paused in his work, straightening to his full height. "I've seen what happens when people with power abuse it. Chaining a woman to a post in the hot sun without a trial isn't justice, it's cruelty." He returned to his task, and Lila found herself studying him more carefully. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. There was a quiet strength about him that she found reassuring despite the circumstances. "Here," he said, handing her a canteen. "You must be thirsty." Lila accepted it gratefully, taking several long swallows of the cool water. "I still don't understand why you're risking so much for a stranger." Ethan knelt to arrange the firewood. "My father taught me that a man's character is revealed by how he treats those who can't help him in return." He struck a match against his boot and touched it to the kindling. "Besides, I believe your story. Harold Wilson's type isn't hard to recognize." As the fire caught and began to crackle, Lila sat down on a fallen log watching the flames. "What happens now?" "The sheriff will be looking for both of us. First, we rest. Then tomorrow we find a way to prove your innocence." Ethan sat across from her, the firelight casting his features into stark relief. "Tell me everything that happened from the beginning." Lila took a deep breath and recounted how she had come to Redemption Creek looking for work after fleeing her uncle's home in Denver. She had found employment at the hotel restaurant where she first encountered Harold Wilson, the mayor's son. "He made it clear what he wanted from me," she said, her voice tight with anger. "When I refused his advances, he threatened me. The next morning, the sheriff and his men burst into my room, claiming they had information I had stolen Harold's gold watch. They found it in my satchel, though I never touched it." She looked up at Ethan. "They wouldn't listen to anything I said. The sheriff just dragged me out and chained me to that post as a lesson." Ethan nodded slowly. "Wilson must have planted the watch while you were working. We need to find someone who might have seen him near your room or who can testify to his character." "Mrs. Fletcher seemed willing to speak up," Lila suggested. "And there's Jenny, the other waitress at the hotel. She warned me about Harold when I first arrived. That's a start." Ethan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out some jerky and hardtack, which he offered to Lila. "It's not much, but it'll keep us going." As they ate their meager meal, Lila found herself growing increasingly curious about the man who had come to her rescue. "You mentioned you were heading to your brother's ranch near Silverton?" Ethan nodded. "Michael's been trying to get me to join him for years. I finally decided it was time to put down some roots." "What did you do before?" she asked, then added hastily, "if you don't mind my asking." A faint smile crossed his face. "A little of everything. Spent some time with the army as a scout, did some bounty hunting, worked cattle drives. Most recently I was a deputy marshal out of Denver." Lila's eyes widened. "You're a lawman," he corrected. "I turned in my badge 3 weeks ago, had enough of chasing other people's troubles." "Yet here you are, involved in mine," she observed. Ethan's smile deepened, transforming his serious face. "Ironic, isn't it? Seems I can't help myself when I see injustice." As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Ethan offered Lila his bedroll, insisting he was accustomed to sleeping rough. Despite her exhaustion, Lila found it difficult to fall asleep, her mind replaying the day's events. She watched as Ethan sat by the fire, his profile outlined against the darkness, keeping watch while she rested. Eventually, the rhythmic sound of the creek and the soft crackling of the fire lulled her into a fitful sleep. She dreamed of being chained again, but this time there was no one to help her. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The fire had burned low and Ethan was kneeling beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder. "You were calling out in your sleep," he explained, withdrawing his hand when he saw she was awake. "Bad dream," Lila nodded, sitting up and pushing her tangled hair away from her face. "What time is it?" "Almost dawn." Ethan moved back to his place by the fire, adding a few sticks to coax the embers back to life. "We should get moving soon. I've been thinking about our next steps." And Lila wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders against the morning chill. "We need to find evidence that Wilson planted that watch. The most direct approach would be to return to town and speak with the people you mentioned, Mrs. Fletcher and Jenny from the hotel." Lila's stomach clenched with fear at the thought of returning to Redemption Creek. "The sheriff will be looking for us." "For me, certainly," Ethan agreed, "but you might be able to move about more freely. The bank robbery will have diverted much of their attention." "You want me to go back alone?" Lila asked, alarmed. Ethan shook his head. "No, we go together, but carefully. I know a few tricks for moving unnoticed, even in a small town." After a quick breakfast of coffee and the last of the hardtack, they broke camp. Ethan seemed preoccupied as he saddled his horse, and Lila sensed he was formulating a plan. "What is it you're not telling me?" she finally asked. Ethan secured the last strap on the saddle before answering. "I've been thinking about the timing of that bank robbery. It seems awfully convenient, happening just when things were getting tense in front of the sheriff's office." "You think it's connected to what happened to me?" Lila asked, skeptical. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But in my experience, coincidences like that are rare. Either way, it works in our favor. The sheriff and his men will be focused on the robbery, giving us a chance to investigate your situation." They mounted the horse as before, with Lila sitting in front of Ethan. As they rode back toward Redemption Creek, she found herself drawing comfort from his presence behind her, solid and reassuring. Despite the danger they were riding toward, she felt safer than she had in a long time. The town was unusually quiet when they approached from the south, using a little-used trail that Ethan knew from previous visits. They left the horse tethered in a stand of trees just outside town and proceeded on foot, keeping to the alleys and back streets. "The general store first," Ethan decided. "Mrs. Fletcher seemed willing to help, and her place will be less watched than the hotel." They made their way cautiously through town, avoiding the main street. Twice they had to duck into shadows as townspeople passed by, but no one noticed them. The back door of Fletcher's general store was unlocked, and they slipped inside, finding themselves in a storeroom stacked with crates and barrels. "Who's there?" a woman's voice called from the front of the store. "A moment later, Mrs." Fletcher appeared in the doorway, a broom clutched in her hands like a weapon. Her eyes widened when she recognized them. "Good Lord, child," she exclaimed, lowering the broom. "The whole town's looking for you too. We need your help, Mrs. Fletcher," Ethan said quietly. Lila is innocent of the theft she was accused of. The older woman glanced nervously toward the front of the store, "Come upstairs to my rooms, it's safer there." She led them through the storeroom to a narrow staircase. "I've got a customer at the moment, I'll be back shortly." Upstairs, they found themselves in a small but tidy sitting room. Through an open door, Lila could see a bedroom beyond. They waited in tense silence until they heard footsteps on the stairs, and Mrs. Fletcher joined them, closing the door firmly behind her. "You two have caused quite a stir," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "Sheriff Marks is furious. He's convinced you're in league with those bank robbers, Mr. Quinn." "That's ridiculous," Lila protested. "He only arrived in town yesterday, just before I was chained up." Mrs. Fletcher nodded. "I believe you, dear. That's why I spoke up. I've seen how Harold Wilson behaves with the young ladies in this town, always thinking his father's position gives him the right to take liberties. We need evidence that he planted that watch," Ethan explained. "Someone who might have seen him near Lila's room, or who can testify to his character in a way that would make the judge doubt his accusation." "Well, as to that, Mrs. Fletcher said, pouring them each a cup of tea from a pot that had been steeping on a small table. "Jenny Miller from the hotel told me just this morning that she saw Harold lurking near the servants' quarters early yesterday, before the theft was reported. She thought he was waiting to pester one of the maids, as is his habit." Lila's heart raced with hope. "That's near my room. If Jenny saw him there, she might be willing to testify." "Perhaps," Mrs. Fletcher said doubtfully, "but she's afraid of losing her position." "The hotel owner, Mr. Parker, is friendly with the mayor." "What about the bank robbery?" Ethan asked, changing the subject. "Has there been any word on whether they caught the robbers?" Mrs. Fletcher's expression became oddly guarded. "That's the strangest thing. The sheriff and his posse returned late last night empty-handed. And this morning, Mayor Wilson announced that it was all a misunderstanding, that his son had raised the alarm after seeing suspicious men, but that nothing was actually stolen." Ethan and Lila exchanged a look of surprise. "A false alarm?" Ethan asked. "So it would seem," Mrs. Fletcher confirmed. "Though some folks are whispering that it was awfully convenient timing, what with you challenging the sheriff the way you did, Mr. Quinn." "My thoughts exactly," Ethan murmured. "Mrs. Fletcher, is there any way you could arrange for us to speak with Jenny without being seen?" The older woman considered this. "She takes her break at the back of the hotel kitchen around noon. There's a small garden there where the staff sometimes sit. I could get a message to her." "That would be very helpful," Ethan said, standing up. "In the meantime, is there somewhere we can wait safely?" Mrs. Fletcher hesitated only briefly. "You can stay here in my rooms. No one will think to look for you above the store." She rose to her feet. "I'll go send word to Jenny now. There's food in the pantry if you're hungry." After she had gone, Lila sank back into her chair, relieved to have found an ally. "Do you think Jenny will help us?" "We'll see," Ethan replied, moving to the window and cautiously peering out at the street below. "If she saw Wilson near your room, her testimony could be crucial." "And what about the bank robbery that wasn't a robbery?" Lila asked. "Do you think the mayor's son staged it to distract from what was happening with me?" Ethan turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "It's possible. The timing was certainly suspicious. If it was a diversion, though, it suggests this goes beyond a spoiled young man upset at being rejected. There might be more at stake here than we realize." They spent the next 2 hours in tense waiting, speaking little. Lila found some bread and cheese in Mrs. Fletcher's pantry, and they ate a small meal. Ethan seemed preoccupied, frequently checking the street below through a gap in the curtains. Shortly after noon, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Fletcher entered with another woman, young, dark-haired, and clearly nervous. She started when she saw Ethan and Lila. "Jenny, these are the folks I told you about," Mrs. Fletcher said gently. "They just want to ask you a few questions." The young woman twisted her apron in her hands. "I can't stay long. Mr. Parker will notice if I'm gone too long." "We understand," Ethan said, his voice reassuring. "Lila tells me you warned her about Harold Wilson when she first arrived in town." Jenny nodded reluctantly. "He's trouble. Has been ever since I started working at the hotel 2 years ago." always putting his hands where they don't belong, promising special favors if girls will meet him after hours. Her cheeks flushed with anger. My friend Betsy lost her position last year after she complained about him to Mr. Parker. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you saw Harold near the servants' quarters yesterday morning, Lila said. Is that true? Yes, Jenny confirmed. It was early before most folks were up. I was heading to the kitchen to start breakfast preparations when I saw him coming down the back stairs, the ones that lead to where the staff rooms are. He looked startled to see me and hurried off without saying anything. Ethan leaned forward. Would you be willing to tell that to a judge? It could help prove that Harold planted the watch in Lila's room. Jenny's eyes widened with fear. I don't know. I need this job, and if the mayor found out I testified against his son. I understand your concern, Ethan said, but without evidence, Lila could face serious charges. She was publicly humiliated yesterday, chained to a post in the hot sun without a trial. Jenny looked at Lila, sympathy evident in her expression. I saw that from the hotel window. It wasn't right what they did to you. She took a deep breath. All right, I'll testify if it comes to that. But I'm scared of what might happen afterward. You're very brave, Lila said gratefully. Thank you. There's something else, Jenny added, lowering her voice. Last night, after the sheriff and his men rode out after those supposed bank robbers, I overheard Harold talking with his father in the hotel dining room. They didn't know I was clearing dishes in the adjacent room. Harold was laughing about how well their plan had worked to get rid of that interfering stranger, meaning you, Mr. Quinn. The mayor told him to keep his voice down, but Harold just kept boasting about how clever they'd been. Ethan's expression hardened. So the bank robbery was a diversion. They staged it to draw attention away from what was happening at the sheriff's office. It seems that way, Jenny agreed, though I don't understand why they would go to such lengths over a simple theft accusation. Neither do I, Ethan admitted. There's more happening here than meets the eye. A bell jingled downstairs, indicating a customer had entered the store. Mrs. Fletcher touched Jenny's arm. You'd better get back to the hotel before you're missed. Go out the back way. After Jenny had departed, Mrs. Fletcher turned to them. What will you do now? Ethan paced the small room, considering their options. We need to understand why the Wilsons are so determined to discredit Lila. A false theft accusation is one thing, but staging a bank robbery as a diversion suggests there's something much bigger at stake. Perhaps it's not about me at all, Lila suggested suddenly. What if it's about you, Ethan? Jenny said she overheard them talking about getting rid of that interfering stranger. What if they recognized you from your time as a deputy marshal? Ethan stopped pacing. It's possible. I've made enemies in my line of work, but I don't recall ever crossing paths with anyone named Wilson. The mayor's been in office for nearly 10 years, Mrs. Fletcher offered. Before that, I believe he came from somewhere in Kansas. Made his fortune in cattle, supposedly, though there were rumors. What rumors? Ethan asked sharply. Mrs. Fletcher looked uncomfortable. Just talk. That not all his business dealings were entirely legitimate, that he might have been involved in rustling operations before he went respectable. Kansas? Ethan repeated, his brow furrowed in concentration. About 10 years ago, I was involved in breaking up a large cattle rustling operation near Dodge City. Several men were arrested, but the ringleader, a man named Warren, escaped. He looked at Mrs. Fletcher. What's the mayor's full name? Silas Wilson, she replied. Though now that you mention it, I recall some old-timers saying he changed his name when he arrived here. Can't remember what they said it used to be. I need to send a telegram, Ethan decided. Is there someone trustworthy who could help with that, Mrs. Fletcher thought for a moment. My nephew Thomas works at the telegraph office. He's a good boy, won't ask questions if I tell him not to. Excellent. I need to contact the marshal's office in Denver. If Mayor Wilson is who I think he might be, there could still be a reward out for his capture. He quickly wrote out a message on a piece of paper Mrs. Fletcher provided. Can your nephew send this and bring the reply directly to you? He can, but it might take some time for a response. She took the paper and tucked it into her pocket. What will you do in the meantime? We need a safer place to wait, Ethan said. If the mayor realizes Jenny overheard his conversation with Harold, she could be in danger, and so might you for helping us. There's an old line shack about 3 miles north of town, Mrs. Fletcher suggested. My late husband used to use it during hunting season. No one goes there this time of year. That sounds perfect, Ethan said. Can you draw me a map? While Mrs. Fletcher sketched directions to the line shack, Lila tried to process everything they had learned. If the mayor was indeed a wanted criminal hiding under a new identity, it would explain the extreme reaction to Ethan's arrival and intervention. It wasn't about her at all. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a convenient pawn in their game. Here, Mrs. Fletcher said, handing Ethan the map. There should be some basic supplies still in the cabin. I'll have Thomas bring any telegram response there once it arrives. Thank you for everything, Lila said, impulsively hugging the older woman. You've risked so much to help us, Mrs. Fletcher patted her back affectionately. Sometimes doing the right thing requires a bit of risk, dear. Now, you two had better get going before anyone gets suspicious about me keeping the store closed this long. They left through the back door as they had entered, keeping to the alleys and shadows as they made their way out of town. Once they reached the trees where Ethan had left his horse, they mounted quickly and headed north, following Mrs. Fletcher's map. The line shack was exactly where she had indicated, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pines. It was a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney at one end and a single window beside the door. Inside, they found a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and some basic cooking implements. It's not much, Ethan observed, but it's secure and hidden. We can wait here for the telegram response. Lila moved to the window, looking out at the surrounding forest. How long do you think it will take? A day, maybe 2. Ethan began clearing dust from the table and chairs. Denver's not far by telegraph, but it might take time to check the old wanted posters and send a reply. As the afternoon waned, they settled into an uneasy waiting pattern. Ethan found some dry firewood stacked against the outside wall and got a fire going in the stove to ward off the evening chill. There were some basic supplies in a cupboard: coffee, beans, flour left from previous occupants. Lila busied herself cleaning the small cabin as best she could with the limited resources available. The physical activity helped distract her from the uncertainty of their situation. As she worked, she found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, the deliberate way he moved, the thoughtful expressions that crossed his face as he considered their next steps. Night fell, and they shared a simple meal of beans cooked over the stove. The single bed presented an awkward dilemma, which Ethan resolved by insisting he would sleep on the floor near the door. I've slept in worse places, he assured her when she protested. You take the bed. Despite her exhaustion, Lila found it hard to fall asleep, her mind racing with the day's revelations. From the slow, measured breathing across the room, she suspected Ethan was also awake, keeping watch even as he rested. Ethan, she ventured softly into the darkness. Yes. His reply came immediately, confirming her suspicion that he wasn't sleeping. Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't ridden into town yesterday. There was a pause before he answered. Anyone with a decent conscience would have done the same. But they didn't, she pointed out. Everyone else just watched. Another pause. Get some sleep, Lila. Tomorrow might be a long day. She closed her eyes, finding comfort in his presence even across the room. Whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it alone. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Ethan was already up when Lila awoke, building up the fire in the stove and brewing coffee from the supplies they had found. I've been thinking, he said, as he handed her a cup of the strong, black liquid. If Mayor Wilson is indeed Warren from the Kansas rustling operation, we need to be prepared for how he might react when cornered. Lila blew on her coffee to cool it. You mean he might become violent? He was dangerous 10 years ago, Ethan confirmed. Killed 2 ranchers who caught his men stealing cattle. If he thinks his cover is blown, there's no telling what he might do to protect himself and his son. What can we do? Lila asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Be prepared, Ethan replied simply. He opened his saddlebag and removed a small revolver which he placed on the table between them. Do you know how to use one of these? Lila eyed the weapon warily. My father taught me the basics before he died, for protection on our farm. Ethan nodded approvingly. Good. I hope you won't need it, but just in case. He pushed the gun toward her. Keep it with you. The day passed slowly. They took turns keeping watch at the window, though no one approached the isolated cabin. Ethan spent some time checking and cleaning his weapons, while Lila did her best to make the small space more habitable. Late in the afternoon, they heard the sound of an approaching horse. Ethan immediately moved to the window, gun drawn. It's a young man, he reported. Matches Mrs. Fletcher's description of her nephew. He opened the door cautiously as the rider drew near. The young man, hardly more than a boy, looked nervous but determined. Mr. Quinn, he asked. I'm Thomas Fletcher. My aunt sent me with a reply to your telegram. He handed over a sealed envelope. Thank you, Thomas, Ethan said, taking the message. Did anyone follow you? The boy shook his head. No, sir, I was real careful, like Aunt Martha said to be. Good lad. Tell your aunt we're grateful for her help. After Thomas had ridden away, Ethan opened the envelope and read the telegram inside. His expression grew grim. I was right, he said, handing the paper to Lila. Silas Wilson is actually James Warren, wanted for cattle rustling and the murder of 2 ranchers near Dodge City in '61. There's still a $500 reward for his capture. Lila scanned the telegram, which confirmed Ethan's statement and added that the Denver office would send word to the nearest federal marshal. So what do we do now? She asked, returning the paper to him. The nearest marshal is probably in Durango, at least 2 days' ride away, Ethan said. By then, Warren or Wilson, as he's known here, might realize we're onto him and flee. We can't just confront him ourselves, Lila protested. He's the mayor. The whole town respects him. Not the whole town, Ethan corrected. Mrs. Fletcher was willing to help us, and Jenny. There might be others who have had their suspicions about the mayor over the years. Even so, it's his word against ours, and he has the sheriff in his pocket. Ethan paced the small cabin, thinking. We need more evidence, something that definitively links Mayor Wilson to James Warren, something that even Sheriff Marks couldn't ignore. What kind of evidence? Lila asked. Warren had a distinctive scar on his left forearm from a branding iron and accident during one of his rustling operations. If Wilson has the same scar, that would be pretty conclusive. And how do you propose we check the mayor's arm for a scar? Lila asked skeptically. Ethan's lips quirked in the beginnings of a smile. I've been giving that some thought. There's a town social tomorrow night, Mrs. Fletcher mentioned it. The mayor is sure to attend. You want to go to a social? Lila was incredulous. The entire town is looking for us. Not as ourselves, Ethan explained. With the right disguises, we might be able to get close enough to confirm whether Wilson is Warren. Lila stared at him, wondering if he had lost his mind. Disguises? Where would we even get such things? I'll ride back to Mrs. Fletcher's at dawn, Ethan said. She might be able to help. In the meantime, we should get some rest. Tomorrow could be a very eventful day. Despite her doubts about Ethan's plan, Lila had to admit it was the only option they had. They couldn't hide in the line shack forever, and without evidence, they had no way to clear her name or expose the mayor's true identity. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to Ethan's steady breathing from his place near the door, Lila found herself thinking not just of their precarious situation, but of the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. There was something about Ethan Quinn that inspired trust, a quiet integrity that she had rarely encountered. Despite the danger they faced, she felt strangely safe in his company. With that comforting thought, she finally drifted off to sleep. Ethan was gone when she awoke the next morning. having left a brief note explaining he had ridden to town to speak with Mrs. Fletcher and would return by midday. Lila spent the morning tidying the cabin and preparing a simple meal from their dwindling supplies, all the while watching anxiously for his return. The sun was high overhead when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Ethan leading a second horse behind his own. He dismounted quickly, carrying several parcels. "Mrs. Fletcher came through," he announced, placing the packages on the table. "She's also spread word that we were spotted heading south toward the territorial border, which should keep the sheriff looking in the wrong direction." Lila examined the parcels curiously. "What did she send?" "Everything we need for tonight," Ethan replied, opening the largest package to reveal a fine blue dress with lace trim. "Mrs. Fletcher says this belonged to her niece, who's about your size. And this," he opened another package, revealing a gentleman's suit and a fake beard, "should be sufficient to disguise me." Lila lifted the dress, admiring the quality of the fabric. "This is beautiful, but I'm not sure about this plan, Ethan. It seems incredibly risky." "It is," he acknowledged. "But sometimes the boldest approach is the least expected. No one will be looking for a well-dressed couple at the town social. And once we're there, how do we check the mayor's arm for a scar without raising suspicion?" "The social includes dancing," Ethan explained. "Mrs. Fletcher says the mayor always participates, usually removing his jacket for the more vigorous dances. With the right timing, we might be able to get a look at his forearm." Lila still had doubts, but she had to admit the plan had a certain audacity that might just work. "And if we confirm he is Warren, what then?" "Then we find sheriff marks and present our evidence, including Jenny's testimony about Harold planting the watch and the telegram confirming Wilson's true identity. Even if Marks is in the mayor's pocket, he can't ignore solid proof of a federal crime." They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for their disguises. Ethan trimmed his beard to better accommodate the false one, while Lila practiced pinning her hair up in a style that would change the shape of her face. They went over every detail of their plan, anticipating potential problems and how to address them. As the sun began to set, they made their final preparations. Lila put on the blue dress, which fit remarkably well, and arranged her hair with the pins Mrs. Fletcher had provided. Ethan donned the suit and attached the false beard, which transformed his appearance considerably. He looked at Lila appreciatively as she emerged from behind the blanket they had hung for privacy. "You look lovely," he said simply. Lila felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Thank you." "You look quite different yourself." "That's the idea." He offered her his arm. "Shall we, Mrs. Quinn?" She raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Quinn?" "For tonight, at least," he replied with a smile. "We're supposed to be a married couple recently arrived from Denver, looking to invest in local businesses. Mrs. Fletcher has already mentioned to a few people that her distant cousins would be attending the social." Lila placed her hand on his arm, suddenly very aware of his proximity. "Well then, Mr. Quinn, I believe we have a social to attend." They rode toward town as darkness fell, taking a roundabout route to approach from the east, where they were less likely to be recognized. The town hall, where the social was being held, was already illuminated with lanterns, and the sound of music and laughter could be heard from outside. Ethan helped Lila dismount, then tied their horses at a hitching post among several others. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Lila took a deep breath and nodded. "As I'll ever be." They climbed the steps and entered the hall, which had been decorated with bunting and flowers for the occasion. Tables laden with food and drink lined one wall, while at the far end, a small group of musicians played a lively tune. The center of the room was filled with dancing couples, and around the edges, townsfolk gathered in small conversational groups. Lila scanned the room nervously, relaxing slightly when she spotted Mrs. Fletcher, who gave them a barely perceptible nod of recognition. There was no sign of the sheriff, but Mayor Wilson was easy to identify, a portly man with graying side whiskers, holding court near the punch bowl with several prominent citizens. There he is, Ethan murmured. And he's wearing a jacket as expected. We'll need to wait for a dance where he might remove it. They moved casually around the perimeter of the room, accepting a cup of punch from a server and nodding politely to those nearby. No one seemed to pay them any particular attention, though Mrs. Fletcher did come over to greet her cousins and introduce them to a few people. As the evening progressed, they maintained their charade, even joining in a simple waltz to avoid standing out. Lila was surprised to discover that Ethan was a competent dancer, guiding her smoothly around the floor. "Where did you learn to dance?" she whispered as they turned. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "My mother insisted all her sons learn proper social graces, said it would serve us well no matter where life took us." "She was right," Lila replied, enjoying the secure feeling of his hand at her waist. After the waltz concluded, the musicians announced a Virginia reel, a more energetic dance that often led participants to remove jackets and shawls. As predicted, Mayor Wilson, who had been persuaded to join the line of dancers, handed his jacket to his wife before taking his position. "This is our chance," Ethan said. "We need to get closer." They moved to stand near the dance area, pretending to watch with interest. As the reel progressed, the dancers grew more animated and Wilson rolled up his sleeves to his elbows. Lila strained to see his left forearm, but from their position, it was impossible to get a clear view. "We need to move," she whispered to Ethan. "I can't see from here." He nodded, and they casually circled the dance area, positioning themselves where Wilson would pass closest during the next figure of the reel. As the dancers came around again, Lila caught a clear glimpse of Wilson's exposed left forearm, and there it was, a distinctive star-shaped scar, exactly as Ethan had described. She squeezed Ethan's arm in silent confirmation. He nodded once, his expression serious. "Now we need to find Sheriff Marks," he murmured. "Mrs. Fletcher said he usually makes an appearance later in the evening." They didn't have to wait long. Just as the reel was concluding, the sheriff entered the hall, looking tired and dusty from riding. He spoke briefly with one of his deputies, then headed toward the refreshment table. "I'll approach him," Ethan said. "Stay close, but not too close. If something goes wrong, make your way to Mrs. Fletcher." Before Lila could protest, Ethan was moving through the crowd toward the sheriff. She followed at a discreet distance, her heart pounding with apprehension. She watched as Ethan engaged Marks in conversation, his posture casual but alert. The sheriff looked confused at first, then suspicious. More words were exchanged, and then to Lila's horror, Marks suddenly reached up and yanked at Ethan's beard, partially dislodging it. "It's Quinn," the sheriff shouted, reaching for his gun. "Stop him!" The hall erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, and in the confusion, Mayor Wilson quickly retrieved his jacket and headed for the door, his son Harold close behind. "They're getting away," Lila cried, forgetting caution in her alarm. Ethan broke free from the sheriff, who was now drawing his weapon, and sprinted after Wilson. Lila hesitated only briefly before following, hiking up her skirts to run more easily. Behind them, she could hear Marks calling for his deputies. Outside, they saw Wilson and Harold mounting horses at the hitching rail. Ethan reached them just as Wilson was about to ride off, grabbing the mayor's reins and yanking the horse's head around. "It's over, Warren," he said firmly. "I know who you are, and so will everyone else once they see that scar on your arm." Wilson's face contorted with fury. "You'll never prove anything, lawman." He kicked at Ethan, trying to free his horse. Harold, meanwhile, had pulled a small pistol from his coat. "Let my father go," he shouted. Lila, seeing the weapon, reacted instinctively. She picked up a rock from the ground and hurled it at Harold with all her strength. It struck his arm, throwing off his aim as he fired. The bullet went wide, but the sound of the gunshot caused Wilson's horse to rear in panic, throwing the mayor to the ground. By now, Sheriff Marks and several deputies had emerged from the hall, guns drawn. "Don't move, any of you," Marks commanded. "Sheriff, listen to me," Ethan said urgently, keeping his hands visible. This man is not Silas Wilson. He's James Warren, wanted for murder and cattle rustling in Kansas. I have proof, a telegram from the marshal's office in Denver confirming his identity. Marks looked skeptical, but some of the townspeople who had followed them outside were murmuring among themselves. "It's true, Sheriff," Mrs. Fletcher called out, pushing her way through the crowd. "And Jenny Miller can testify that she saw Harold planting the stolen watch in Lila's room." "They've been deceiving this town for years." Wilson struggled to his feet, his face a mask of rage. "This is absurd. I've been a respected citizen of this town for a decade." "Then you won't mind showing us your left forearm," Ethan suggested calmly. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to Wilson. The mayor looked around wildly, realizing he was cornered. In a desperate move, he lunged toward Harold, grabbing his son's pistol. "Get back," he shouted, waving the gun. "I'll shoot the first person who tries to stop me." Sheriff Marks trained his own weapon on Wilson. "Put it down, Mayor. Don't make this worse than it already is." "It's over, Warren," Ethan added, his voice steady. "There's nowhere to run." For a tense moment, Wilson seemed to consider his options, his eyes darting from face to face in the crowd. Then, with a cry of frustration, he threw down the pistol and sank to his knees. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said bitterly. "I built a new life here. I became someone respectable." "You built that life on lies," Sheriff Marks said, his expression grim as he moved forward to restrain the fallen mayor. "And on intimidating anyone who got in your way." He looked at Ethan and Lila with newfound respect. "I owe you both an apology. It seems I've been enforcing the wrong kind of justice in this town." In the days that followed, the truth about Silas Wilson, or James Warren, as he was properly known, came to light. The federal marshal arrived from Durango to take him into custody, along with his son Harold, who was charged as an accomplice in several of his father's schemes, including framing Lila for theft. The town of Redemption Creek was left to reconcile with the fact that their mayor had been a wanted criminal all along. Many expressed shame at how they had treated Lila, though she accepted their apologies with grace. Sheriff Marks, to his credit, publicly acknowledged his mistakes and vowed to serve the town more justly in the future. For Lila and Ethan, the resolution of the crisis brought a new dilemma: what to do next. They had grown close during their days in hiding, but Ethan still had plans to join his brother's ranch near Silverton, and Lila needed to rebuild her life. On their last evening in Redemption Creek, they sat together on the porch of Mrs. Fletcher's house, where Lila had been staying since her name was cleared. "So you're leaving tomorrow," Lila said, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains with gold and crimson. Ethan nodded. "Michael's expecting me. I've delayed long enough already." He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "What about you? Will you stay here?" Lila sighed. "I don't know. Mrs. Fletcher has offered to let me work in the store, and the people have been kind since the truth came out. But it's hard to forget how quickly they turned against you," Ethan finished for her. "Yes," she admitted. "Though I understand why it happened. The mayor was a powerful man, and few had the courage to question him." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Ethan turned to face her directly. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and earnest. "To Silverton." Lila's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "Michael's ranch is large enough to need extra help," Ethan continued, "and the town is growing. There would be opportunities for you there. But more importantly," he took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. "I've come to care for you, Lila, more than I expected to. The thought of riding away and leaving you behind doesn't sit right with me." Lila looked down at their joined hands, emotion welling up inside her. Over the past week, she had tried to ignore the growing feelings she had for this man who had risked so much to help her. Now, faced with his honest declaration, she couldn't deny her own heart any longer. "I care for you too," she whispered. "But I barely know you, Ethan. We've been through an extraordinary situation together, but real life isn't all danger and excitement." "I know that," he agreed, "and I'm not asking for promises. Just a chance for both of us to see if what we've started here could grow into something more. He squeezed her hand. What do you say? Are you willing to take a chance on an ex-lawman trying to settle down? Lila looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, and made her decision. Yes, she said simply. I'll come with you to Silverton. Ethan's face broke into a smile that transformed his usually serious features. You won't regret it, he promised, raising her hand to his lips. I'd better not, she teased, feeling lighter than she had in years. They set out for Silverton the next morning, riding side by side on horses provided by grateful townspeople. The road ahead was long, winding through mountain passes and valleys, but Lila faced it with optimism. Whatever the future held, she would meet it on her own terms, with a man who had proven his worth when it mattered most. As they rode, Ethan shared stories of his brother's ranch and the town of Silverton, painting a picture of the life that awaited them. Layla listened, offering her own hopes and plans for their new beginning. The easy companionship they had developed during their ordeal continued, deepening with each mile they traveled together. By the time they reached Silverton 3 days later, Lila knew she had made the right decision. Michael Quinn welcomed them warmly, a younger version of Ethan with the same steady gaze and quiet strength. The ranch house was spacious and well-built, situated in a valley with mountains rising majestically on all sides. It's beautiful, Lila breathed as she surveyed her new home. It is, Ethan agreed, standing close beside her. And it's just the beginning. Over the next few months, Lila found her place in the Quinn brothers' world. She took over management of the ranch house, bringing order and comfort to what had been a purely functional bachelor dwelling. In town, she made friends among the merchants and their wives, establishing herself as a respected member of the community. Ethan, true to his word about putting down roots, threw himself into ranch work alongside his brother. The skills that had made him an effective lawman, patience, attention to detail, and a calm approach to challenges served him well in his new occupation. In the evenings, he and Lila would sit on the porch watching the sunset and talking about their day. Their relationship grew naturally, without pressure or haste. Ethan proved to be a considerate suitor, bringing Lila wildflowers from the meadow or a book from the general store that he thought she might enjoy. She, in turn, learned the foods he preferred and the quiet ways he showed affection. 6 months after their arrival in Silverton, on a crisp autumn evening with the aspen leaves turning gold on the mountainsides, Ethan proposed properly, with a small silver ring he had purchased in town. I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, he said as they walked along the creek that ran through the ranch property. But I can't imagine my life without you in it now. Will you marry me, Lila? She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes bright with emotion. Yes, Ethan, I will. They were married in the small church in Silverton 2 weeks later, with Michael serving as best man and Mrs. Fletcher making the journey from Redemption Creek to stand with Lila. It was a simple ceremony, but filled with genuine joy and the good wishes of their new community. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm after the wedding. The ranch prospered under the brothers' careful management, and Lila found fulfillment in her role as Ethan's wife and partner. She started a small kitchen garden that expanded with each season, eventually supplying fresh vegetables to neighbors and the town mercantile. A year after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Ethan's father. Lila discovered that Ethan, for all his outward toughness, was a gentle and devoted father, spending hours rocking the baby to sleep or walking the floor with him when he was fretful. As James grew from infant to toddler, Lila often thought back to that fateful day in Redemption Creek when a stranger had stepped forward to challenge an injustice. How different her life would have been if Ethan Quinn hadn't ridden into town at precisely the right moment. The memory of being chained to that post in the hot sun still haunted her occasionally, but it was fading with time, replaced by happier recollections. On the 2nd anniversary of their arrival in Silverton, Michael announced his engagement to Sarah Donovan, the schoolteacher who had been casting admiring glances his way for months. The wedding was planned for the spring, and preparations became a family affair, with Lila helping Sarah design her dress and plan the celebration. "Did you ever imagine life would turn out this way?" Ethan asked Lila one evening as they sat on the porch after putting James to bed. "When you were chained to that post in Redemption Creek, did you think you'd end up here?" Lila shook her head, leaning against his shoulder. "I couldn't see past that moment. I was just trying to survive." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "But I'm grateful every day that you came along and pulled that post from the ground." Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Best decision I ever made, stepping into that situation. Got me a wife, a son, and a future I never expected." "And what about giving up your badge?" Lila asked. "Do you ever miss that life?" Ethan considered the question seriously, as was his way. "Sometimes I miss the clarity of it, knowing who the bad guys were and what needed to be done. But this life," he gestured toward the ranch, the mountains, and her, "this is what I was looking for without knowing it. A place to belong, people to care for, work that matters." Lila reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that the years and the weather had etched there. "I love you, Ethan Quinn. Through whatever comes next, I love you." He turned his head to kiss her palm. "And I love you, Lila Quinn, from now until the end of my days." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, they sat together in companionable silence, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together just as they had that first day in Redemption Creek, when a cowboy had refused to look the other way, and a woman had found the courage to fight for justice. In the years that followed, their family grew with the addition of twin daughters, Emma and Abigail, who brought a new level of joy and chaos to the ranch. The Quinn brothers expanded their operation, buying adjacent land when it became available and establishing a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock. Lila, now in her 30s, had become a respected figure in Silverton, known for her good sense, generosity, and occasional fierce advocacy when she perceived an injustice. The story of how she and Ethan had met had become something of a local legend, embellished with each retelling until it sometimes seemed more myth than reality. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised her with a silver pendant engraved with the date they had arrived in Silverton. "To new beginnings," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "and to the woman brave enough to seize them." Lila touched the pendant, remembering all they had been through together. "We've built a good life, haven't we?" she said softly. "The best," Ethan agreed, pulling her close. "And we're just getting started." As they looked out over the ranch, their home, their legacy to their children, they both knew the truth of those words. Their story, which had begun with an act of courage and justice on a dusty street in Redemption Creek, would continue to unfold in ways they could not yet imagine. But whatever came, they would face it as they always had. Together, with strength, integrity, and an abiding love that had been forged in adversity and tempered by time. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they had a moment to themselves, Lila would look at Ethan and remember that first glimpse of him, a stranger on horseback, stopping to question an injustice when everyone else looked away. In that moment, though neither of them knew it then, their futures had become irrevocably entwined, setting them on a path that would lead through danger and uncertainty to the peace and fulfillment they now enjoyed. It wasn't always an easy road, life rarely is, but it was theirs, and they traveled it side by side, day by day, season by season, year by year. And in the end, that was all that mattered.